Today we're continuing in our study of the book of Revelation, and I want to begin with chapter 13 of Revelation. We're only going to cover the first part of this chapter today, then we're going to be looking at the second part of the chapter next time. In chapter 12, we begin a new section of the book of Revelation. And I showed you that what that means. In chapter 12, we saw the angel with the little scroll. We saw the woman and the dragon and the conflict between the woman and the dragon, and how the dragon was cast out of heaven and so on, went to war with the woman and her child. We saw how the dragon tried to destroy the woman by spewing out a river of water from his mouth, but the woman was preserved from that. The earth swallowed up the river of water. I talked to you last time a little bit about the significance of water in terms of the biblical view of the sea, the abyss. The ocean and the waters of the sea can be used in terms of judgment. You know, Noah's, the flood of Noah judging the world. And I also showed you that in the biblical view, waters can stand for chaos, and that which is opposed to God and His goodwill. The primordial water back in Genesis 1, that God brought order to that, and so on. And so today we see another example of this. The devil makes war on the woman, and the woman is carried off to safety in the wilderness and nurtured there. And we talked a little bit about that last time. And then in verse 17 of chapter 12, then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring. Now this is referring to the church. Her son, the dragon tried to destroy her son, but failed. The son then went to heaven with the resurrection of Jesus. Now the dragon is making war on the rest of her offspring. And that's a reference to faithful Christians in every age between the first advent of Jesus and the second advent of Jesus. And he defines who those faithful offspring were in chapter 12, verse 17. Those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Those are the offspring of the women upon whom the dragon makes war. Now, some of our versions say that the next phrase, and he stood on the sand of the sea, is part of verse 17. Some say no, it's actually verse 18. This is where some of the breakdown of verses and everything kind of misleads us. But verse 18, or that clause in verse 17, he stood on the sand of the sea, is actually connected to the next set of visions in chapter 13, verse 1. All right? So the dragon makes war on the woman. He's furious. And the commentators will tell you that the dragon is furious, well, because he hates God's people, but he is also furious because he knows his time is short. The dragon knows that his time is short. You see, Satan has a perspective on the hidden things that we do not have. We saw in the Gospels where the devils recognized Jesus and he commanded them to be silent. Well, the devils and the fallen angels are spiritual beings, and they see the spiritual reality of Jesus in a way that we don't. So the devil is furious because he knows that his time is short. He knows the doom that awaits him. And he's going to cause as much mischief as he can until that doom arrives. And so he stood on the sand of the sea. Okay. A very vivid image. You have the beach and the dragon now standing on the sand of the sea. And chapter 13, verse 1, and I saw a beast rising out of the sea, 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. Now, if you've been into the pre-mill dispensational interpretations of the book of Revelation, you go into great detail about the significance of each of these heads and each of the horns and all of that. And I'm going to show you a little bit different way, perhaps, of looking at this. Okay. I've been talking to folks about our study of Revelation, and for those who have been educated in the pre-mill dispensational, Hal Lindsey vision of Revelation, it requires a huge effort to break away from that a little bit, and to look at Revelation from a little bit different perspective, and that's what we're going to do here. So here we have the beast from the sea. Sort of imagine a Godzilla type figure rising out of the sea and coming onto the land. At the summons of the dragon, he comes out of the sea as one of the dragon's allies. And we already saw who was the dragon, Satan, the evil one. Now, about the two beasts here, generally, then I'll focus on this particular one. In this chapter, you see the two beasts, the beast from the sea and the land beast. The beast from the sea and the beast from the land are examples of how the dragon makes war on the offspring of the woman. We talked a little bit when we went off camera last time that the dragon has other tactics that he uses in his war against God's people. And I mentioned to you, for example, the 8 deadly thoughts are examples of the devil's war, how he makes war against God's people. Well, these two beasts are only examples of a variety of ways in which the devil makes war on God's people. This is how he afflicts Christians during those periods of active persecution. He uses other means to afflict Christians when they are not experiencing active persecution, such as the temptations that come to us, or false prophets and false teachers who would deceive us and turn us away from Jesus, okay? But John is addressing Revelation to Christians who are experiencing active persecution. And so the emphasis here is on these two beasts who are instruments of persecution of the church. Now, where do these images come from? What are their roots in the Old Testament? Well, they come out of Job, chapter 40 and chapter 41. Chapter 40 in Job is dealing with the land beast, Behemoth. And chapter 41 deals with the sea beast, Leviathan. But John is taking these images from Job and redoing them in his own set of visions here. Okay? In Jewish tradition, according to one commentator, Leviathan and Behemoth were created on the 5th day of creation. Leviathan to dwell in the sea, Behemoth to dwell on the land. And in Jewish tradition, we're looking at non-biblical tradition here, these beasts symbolize the powers of evil, and they were to be destroyed at the final judgment. So John's using elements perhaps not just of biblical tradition, but of non-biblical Jewish tradition that the Jews would have understood in his day. Matthew Henry, the Puritan commentator on the Bible, on his commentary on Job, says, the Behemoth is perhaps intended, as well as the Leviathan, to represent those proud tyrants and oppressors whom God had just now challenged Job to abase and bring down. They think themselves as well fortified against the judgments of God as the elephant with his bones of brass and iron and so on. Okay? So Matthew Henry picks up on this idea that Behemoth and Leviathan are to be interpreted as enemies of God. Very formidable enemies of God. When you read references to these creatures in the Bible, you see that they are very formidable indeed. So that's what we're looking at here. Now we go to verses 1 through 10 of this chapter 13, and we look at the beast from the sea. The Old Testament roots of this vision of the beast from the sea, as well as the passage in Job, come out of Daniel 7. And I think we're going to see that in verse 2 of chapter 13, this beast that John sees coming out of the sea is a composite of the 4 beasts in Daniel 7. It's a composite of the 4 beasts in Daniel 7. This beast bears a family resemblance to the dragon. If you look back in chapter 12, verse 3, the dragon is described as a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. Okay? So this beast bears a family resemblance to the dragon. And I told you back in chapter 12 that the dragon had diadems on his head, and the beast has diadems on his head, to show that the beast is subordinate to the dragon. The dragon has ultimate rule and mandates his will through the beast. So the sea beast rises out of the watery, dark home of the dragon and shows itself to be the same devilish nature and on the devil's side. I'm quoting from one of the commentators here. All right? So there's a family resemblance between these. And the dragon is on the seashore. The beast comes out of the sea at the summons of the dragon, and he resembles the dragon. He's a subordinate to the dragon. So whatever the earthly corollary of this heavenly beast, this spiritual vision is, we are to understand that the earthly corollary of this beast, whatever that might be, operates at the beck and call of the dragon, of the evil one. Are you with me on that? Too many words? Okay. Now, what about these numbers, 7 and 10? Well, remember, we're dealing with highly symbolic visions and highly symbolic numbers here. And biblically, 7 and 10 are numbers that indicate fullness or a universality. So 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 diadems are symbols of sovereignty and universal power, universal rule, authority. So the beast now, this shows us that this beast reigns supreme within the boundaries of its rule. This beast is the sovereign within the boundaries of its rule. Okay? We're going to look a little bit about some of these heads and all that, what they might signify. But you don't want to get wrapped up on, well, this head is that, and this diadem is that, or this horn is that. It's the bigger picture that we're interested in here. And so this beast that emerges now is shown to be sovereign. Okay? Again, another commentator says, the heads and the horns and the diadems symbolize the beast's false claims of sovereign, universal authority over against the true sovereign, universal authority of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who also wears many diadems. Do you understand the symbolic nature of what's going on here? All right. The blasphemous names written on the heads of this beast represent the beast's false claims to divinity. Whenever an individual or an entity like a nation state claims absolute sovereignty over its people, it's making a claim for divinity. Only God is absolutely sovereign. Only God has a claim, a legitimate claim, on every part of a human being's life. And when a nation state or an emperor or a ruler or a president or any other high and mighty individual makes an absolute claim like that, they are claiming divinity. They are claiming divine sovereignty. And that's what's going on with the blasphemous names on the head of this beast. And it's well known that the Roman emperors at the time that John wrote this gave themselves divine titles. They called themselves Soter, which means Savior. They called themselves Lord, which means God. And we've already seen that was the issue with the Christians of Revelation. They were preparing themselves to face a time when they would have to pour out an offering to an image of Caesar and say, Caesar is Lord. Lord doesn't just mean kind sir, it means God. Okay? And since Caesar claimed to be the embodiment of the genius, the spiritual genius of Rome, Caesar himself was seen as a god, a godlike being. And so this is blasphemy. Only God is God. And to attribute divine attributes to anything less than God is blasphemy. And for anything less than God to claim worship is blasphemy. So do you see what's going on? Again, I want to pause and answer any questions you might have or any observations. Okay? Go ahead, work. I saw, you didn't even have to say anything. I could see that you were going to.
Well, I was just thinking about it. It seemed like John has made things really complicated here over what's probably not such a complicated subject. And this is sort of following up on what I said last week about it's easy to get confused and led astray by some of this writing.
Yes.
And it can be frustrating because it's, again, once you boil it down, this could be said in a couple of sentences rather than a bunch.
But then it wouldn't be the book of Revelation. and then we wouldn't have to sit down and try to actually unpack the context from the Old Testament and actually think about what's going on here and ask for God's inspiration on this. You follow me? We wouldn't be as actively engaged in this as we would if it was just written in engineering speak. Yeah, go ahead.
And, you mentioned that these people, contemporaries who were reading this, obviously it was clear they understood Caesar being Lord. But I mean, that extended all down through history with divine right of rulers through Europe in modern times. Soviet states, the socialist states claiming to be the sole right for individuals. So I mean, that corollary exists today.
Well, the divine right of rulers in Europe in the medieval period was a bit different because that did not give them carte blanche to serve as totalitarian dictators. That was in a time when the church, you had the sovereign, you had the nobles, you had the church, okay, and they were sort of in balance there. And the divine right of monarchs, if I understand it correctly, was that the ultimate sovereignty of the monarch is invested by God, okay. But it was the church and the nobles all had rights of their own as well, and they all kept each other in balance.
But the expression of that was that they were in ultimate control.
They were in ultimate control under God. Okay, that's why you had the formality of the church, the Pope putting the crown on the monarch's head and all of that sort of stuff. It was the monarch was the supreme human authority in balance with the church in the realm of the government. Okay, but the church was also an authority, and the nobles were also authorities. It was never a totalitarian type of thing. It caused scandal when Napoleon took the throne, and I don't know if it's an urban legend or not. Napoleon took the crown off of the bishop's hand and put it on his own head. That is a totalitarian state. Okay, but you're right about the modern forms of tyranny. After the Enlightenment comes along and dethrones God, the God of the Bible. They were content in the Enlightenment to talk about a deity, this deistic God out there, undefined, undefinable, certainly not the God of the Bible. Okay, but the Enlightenment comes along and dethrones the God of the Bible, and from now on, the supreme sovereignty rests in man. And depending on who you're looking at, the supreme sovereignty rests in the people. Okay, well, how do you get a one-man dictatorship out of that? If the supreme sovereignty is in the people, well, obviously, the supreme dictator speaks for the people, embodies the will of the people. This is why democracy can be such an awful form of government. The leader can come to power and say, I have a mandate from the people. My will reflects the will of the people that elected me. Right? And then you have a democracy. There you have a dictatorship right there. The key to understanding that is, again, that the Enlightenment was a project to build a human, assemble a secular version of God's kingdom on earth without reference to the God of the Bible. Man and man's will are sovereign, according after the Enlightenment. That's where we are today.
And we're proud of that.
We're a product of that.
Is that not the humanist view?
Yeah, that would be the
there?
humanist view. Yeah, sure. And we're very much a product of that. Very, very much a product of that. And I don't know what the way out is, frankly. I don't see a way out at this point. Okay? People are scandalized by 10 Commandments. Oh, I can't be under the will of God. The law of God is oppressive, and he's a big old killjoy. Doesn't want me to have any fun and all that. How many volumes and thousands of pages are there in the Federal Register? And you add state laws and local laws, and then all the enforceable regulations that bureaucracies promulgate all the time. Which would you rather be under, 10 Commandments or that? Okay, so the point is that this beast coming out of the sea is claiming absolute sovereignty and godlike authority. All right, verse 2. The beast I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it, the dragon gave his power and throne and great authority. Well, back in Daniel 7, the lion, the bear, and the leopard were separate beasts in his visions, okay? Each of which represented a separate successive world empire. The Medo-Persians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, and the Romans. One after the other. In this passage, the beast that John sees, this beast combines the attributes of those separate empires. All right? And that, in order to symbolize that this beast, and for John it was the Roman Empire, it's more than just one in a succession of empires. This beast is the culmination, the epitome of the empires that came before it. It gathers within itself the pomp and glory and power of all of these empires, and it supersedes them in its power, in its fearsomeness, its ruthlessness, its glory, its majesty, and all these other things. So that's what's going on there. That's why John combines these other separate beasts seen by Daniel into one beast. Okay. Rome in his day was the epitome of world empire. All right, you get that. And we see this going on throughout history. It seems like every nation, every empire since then has been even bigger and more ruthless, more totalitarian. Largely because of technology, advances in technology, and things like that. Nothing on earth has surpassed, in terms of magnitude or their capacity to interfere in the lives of millions of people, nothing has surpassed the empires of the 20th century. The great totalitarian states that grew out of the Enlightenment. And now human beings are talking about a world empire. We need to have one world government with one world currency. Okay? Governed by a handful of elite leaders in Geneva or someplace like that. That will put everything right. Do you believe that, my friend? That, by the way, is the reason why I lean libertarian. I'm not a libertarian, but I lean that way politically. Because human nature is such that you can't trust human beings with absolute power. And so it seems to me reasonable that a decentralized political environment is the best, a decentralized polity, where other forms of sovereignty are available to people. It used to be families were sovereign. How many of you still remember the old saying that we don't hear much of anymore? A man's home is his castle. We haven't heard that for a long time, have we? Families used to be semi-autonomous, loci, you might say, of authority. And nobody interfered with the family. You know, family issues, that was, and then the communities and the churches and all of that. Each one, fraternal organizations, labor unions, all sorts of stuff. There were many different areas of authority, decentralized authority, that built up our understanding of culture and civilization. Well, today those things are gone. There's no place in your experience as a human being where government doesn't assert a claim. Am I exaggerating? I'm not exaggerating at all, my friend. Okay? There's only one sovereignty in modern life today, and that's the state. And increasingly, the state asserts claims of authority over every single area of your life. They're already recording every email that you send, every tweet that you send, and granted, there's such a volume of information being stored, you'll fly under the radar, but if you should appear on that radar, forget about it. Because there's nothing in your life that is hidden anymore. Nothing in your life is hidden. Okay? So what we're seeing is a progression throughout history. All right? And again, in our century, largely because of the vast increase in population in the world and the vast increase in technology that gives states the ability to be oppressive in ways they could not have been 150 years ago. Now, this is probably being recorded now. I will stand by whatever I say. That's all right. If you feel the need to call your local office of DHS, that's okay. Okay? But I don't think I'm exaggerating. And if you think I am, if I'm overstating this, just call me on it. Because that's not my intent. I really don't have a political agenda. My point is, the dynamics we see at work in Revelation are still at work in the world today, are they not? All right. The scary thing about this is that the claims to sovereignty of the dragon, or the beast out of the sea, is suprahuman. All right? This beast isn't simply inspired by human beings with their ego and pride and will to power. This beast receives its power and authority and throne from the dragon. It's an instrument of the dragon in its war against God's people. And so, as mighty as Rome is, and again, by extrapolation, as mighty as the empires of the world are when they turn away from God, it is inspired and empowered by the dragon. And so, to quote one of the commentators for John, the current embodiment of the chaos monster is Rome. But John sees Rome as the residual legatee, a representative of all the pagan empires of the past. And the evil spirit inspiring Rome as potentially able to dominate other world empires after Rome. So the dragon and the beast include world empires of the past and the present and potentially of the future. Unquote. Go ahead.
I wonder, just thinking about it, pertaining to my previous comment, why John wrote it so complicated. If he wrote it this way so he would not be grabbed and just off with your head kind of thing, because this is very sedacious.
This is sedacious. There are some scholars who will say that Revelation is impenetrable to us because it was written in code. So the Roman authorities wouldn't pick up on it. But stop and think about that. They weren't that stupid. Right? If the Roman authorities believe that there's a seditious document circulating out there in Asia Minor, all they need to do is snatch up a few people from those churches and say, translate this for us. They had intelligence services. They had secret police, just like today. All they would have had to do is snatch up a pastor, right? And say, tell us what, unravel the code. Right? There it is. So, yeah, it's not written in code. Again, it's written to people that were far more used to dealing with symbolism than we are. They were far more grounded in their Old Testament than we are. And they would have apprehended this much quicker than us. All right, verse 3. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound. But its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. Now, a more literal translation of that passage, or that verse would be, and one of the heads of him was as slain unto death, and the wound, the word there is plague, and it can mean plague or wound. If it's used in Revelation to refer to God's judgments, the plagues, was healed. All right, so let me see if I can unpack what that means for you. This verse is possibly a reference to the year-long civil war that followed after the Emperor Nero committed suicide. And the entire future of the Roman state was in question for about a year. After Nero committed suicide, there was a period of a year called the Year of the Four Caesars. Civil war in Rome, one Caesar after another. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and then finally Vespasian. It was a period of incredible turmoil in the Roman Empire. Now, the Christians watching this would probably have interpreted Nero's suicide as God's judgment on him. That's the word plague there. Its mortal wound was healed. The plague was healed. In other words, Nero commits suicide. Rome appears to be falling to pieces during this period of civil war. And the Christians are looking at this as a plague, God's judgment on Rome. All right. This turmoil and the death of Nero may have led them to believe that Rome itself was dying. The beast itself was dying, this persecuting entity. All right. But after Vespasian took the throne and everything settled out again, it would appear that the Roman state as a whole was back to life. Okay. You follow me on that? The Christians out there in the hinterlands hear about Nero's suicide, and Rome now is tottering on the brink, and one emperor after another rises and falls in this civil war that goes on. Okay, and they're maybe thinking God's judging the Romans for his persecution of the church. God's judging the beast. But then Vespasian comes along, takes control, and everything settles out and back to business as usual.
So how does that translate, if that's just a single reference, how does that translate universally?
As far as over time?
Yeah.
That probably would just point us to the fact that nations come and go, if you want to interpret it that way. Empires come and go, rise and fall. But that verse, I think, is specifically about the mortal wound healed and all that. I think that's specifically referring to Nero and the year of turmoil that followed, which then gives the appearance of the beast coming back from the brink of death or from the dead. As far as today goes, I don't know. People are saying, well, we're looking for some leader today in modern times who's going to be assassinated and then come back from the dead. That's that pre-mill dispensational interpretation of it. Fred.
Carl, how do you square this then with your early date of the book of Revelation written during the reign of Nero?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's an argument against the early date. If it was written later under Domitian, the assassination of Nero would have already been a couple of generations in the past. Yeah, that's an argument against that. Go ahead.
Well, I think this speaks to a universal problem that people have with regard to society as they live in, that people crave stability. And it reminds me, there's an old Chinese curse. It's a curse. It says, may you live in interesting times. And that's not a blessing, that's a curse. And the point is that people will surrender their allegiance to anything that gives them stability,
Yeah, sure.
or an appearance of stability. And if you look throughout history, this goes on and on and on. People want stability. And part of this is very natural. We want to be able to live our lives. We want to be able to raise our families. We want to be able to have some success in life. That's only natural. That's fairly noble aspirations. But how we go about it and what we surrender our allegiance to get that, that's where the problem comes in. And what you're seeing here is really a commentary. Yes, it's a commentary. I think it's a pretty accurate statement what you said about Rome, but it's a commentary of what's going on time and time again.
Yeah.
It's why people fell in line with the Nazis.
Yeah. Kathy.
Well, I have a question about the beast getting his authority from the dragon.
Yes.
Dragon represents
Satan, the
Satan.
evil one, yeah.
The beast and.
Roman
evil
Empire,
people.
the emperor as the embodiment of the empire, but the empire itself. And it's specifically with regard to its godlessness, its worship of its own power and sovereignty, and its persecution of God's people.
So in a way, Satan gave up his power and just.
Well, it confers it upon the beast. Yeah, the beast is acting as the instrument of Satan. Yeah.
I was thinking that's the word I was thinking. It's just, the beast is an instrument, whatever.
Yeah, the beast is the instrument of Satan here. Okay. All right, so maybe you think that's far-fetched interpretation or not. I think it fits the context here. The Roman state as a whole seems to have come back from the dead, not Nero. There was tradition that Nero would come back from the dead, but I'm not sure that's informing this at all. It's more a question of that Rome appeared to be in its death throes in the year after Nero's suicide and then came back. Now, the ungodly people who gave their highest allegiance to Rome and their highest loyalty to Rome rejoiced at the outcome of the Civil War and the reestablishment of order under Vespasian. And this would be verse 4. They worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast? Who can fight against it?" Most likely, this worship of the dragon was not conscious devil worship. You know, this is one of Satan's wiles. He's convinced us that he doesn't exist. The average citizen of the Roman Empire probably thought that worshiping the beast, that is, offering libations to an image of Caesar, and being loyal to the beast, and supporting the beast's campaign of persecution of the Christians and so on. The average member of the empire probably thought that was just simple patriotism.
Good citizen.
What's that?
Good citizen.
You're a good citizen. Okay? But remember, the beast is the instrument of Satan. Satan's the hidden string puller behind the scenes. So they gave the Roman state the honor. They worshipped and honored the Roman state. They were actually worshiping and honoring the power behind the state. You see what's going on there? I feel like I'm losing somebody.
How does that then, I guess, how does that then relate to modern, I mean, Hitler didn't persecute the Christians, he persecuted the Jews. But I guess you could, but the Jewish people followed right along, or not the Jews, but the German people for the most part followed right along. I mean, there were some standouts that didn't, but they just followed. So I guess you could relate it to modern.
Well,
Could you? I mean,
Dietrich Bonhoeffer would be surprised to hear that Hitler didn't persecute the Christians. He persecuted Christians and Jews and Gypsies and Slavs. And,
that's true. Anybody who was not.
Yeah, but there was a huge scandal about that whole Nazi regime in that the German church, the Protestant church, the Lutherans by and large, went along. They called themselves German Christians. And they bought Hitler's policies. The actual genocide of the Jews and others didn't begin until later in the war. All right? And earlier on, the churches bought into Hitler's program largely for what somebody made the comment, stability. He was creating jobs, he built the Autobahns, he was rebuilding Germany's military behind the scenes, he despised the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which was usually unjust, treaty, and all of that. And by the time a lot of those Christian leaders realized the truth, they had already been compromised, and it was too late. It's interesting that a lot of the Jewish rabbis, the Jews in Germany, there weren't that many in Germany. They were in other parts of Central Europe, who were largely middle class. They were thoroughly German. They thought of themselves as Germans. They were law-abiding. And they could not bring themselves to believe that Hitler was actually intending to send them off to labor camps and kill them. They couldn't believe that. And their own rabbis were telling them that that's not happening. Okay. I was reading about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. One of the only instances where the Jews actually resisted being carted off, and they only started resisting when survivors from one of the death camps made their way back to Warsaw and told them what was going on. You're not being shipped east to go to work camps, you're being shipped east to be killed. And then an uprising happened against the SS, okay, and it was put down, of course. But that's one of the only places I'm aware of in that era where the Jews resisted. See, this is part of the problem with being a law-abiding citizen. You don't know where, you can't believe that the government could turn against you. So I commend to you Hummel's book, R.J. Hummel's book, Death by Government. It's a big, thick book, and there are any pictures. And he looks back over the history of the 20th century. He calls it democide. And he looks back over the history of the 20th century and gives a number, I forget what the number is, but by orders of magnitude, more people in the 20th century have been killed by their own governments than by foreign enemies in wartime. By orders of magnitude. Okay. Now, go ahead, Cal.
Yeah, in light of what we're talking about here in these first 4 verses of this chapter 13, and I lent you the book recently too, and I really commended the people, the book, and I forget the author's name, but the title is In the Garden of Beasts. And,
yes.
And it deals with the U.S. ambassador, whose name I also forgot, brain cramp here, from 1936 to 1940 to the German government. And what is so chilling about that book, it's an engrossing book, is how masses of people, as you say, can gradually move in this position of compromise, can gradually move into getting along by going along. And it's never a big thing. It's a very tiny incremental thing, and then all of a sudden they can wake up and realize that they're bought out. Okay, and it's all kinds of people. It's good, decent people. It's opportunistic people. It's people in the range of that.
Yeah.
But how the overwhelming masses of people can decide to get along by going along a bit at a time, and never see where they're going with it.
And that's how we become compromised. And you know, it's incrementalism, and you know, you become inured to evil in small doses. You know what I mean? I want to finish off here real quick. I ran over, but I'm not preaching, so that's okay. I want to finish off with verse 4. We'll pick up on verse 5 next time, but let me just finish this. I said that the average Roman would just felt he was just being a patriotic citizen, okay? But the honor and allegiance that they're giving to Rome is actually honor and allegiance to the dragon. And my note here is behavior reflects the orientation of the heart. And I think what Jesus says about false prophets applies here. You will recognize them by your fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles. Every healthy tree bears good fruit. The diseased tree bears bad fruit. And so on and so forth. You will recognize them by their fruits. And so the fruits of the Roman Empire in terms of their relationship with the Christians were evil. From Satan. And that's how you knew that the Roman Empire in that respect was from Satan, because of its fruit. So, in conclusion, a person who worships his nation more than God is in reality worshiping the dragon whose authority lies behind ungodly nations. And there it is, as clear as even Worth could understand.
Thank you.
Let me turn this off.